the 18th lecture series organized by the Medico Pastoral Association, Bangalore. I'm Devika Babu, counselor at the Medico Pastoral Association, who will be the master of ceremonies for today's function. As most of you are aware, the Medico Pastoral Association, registered in 1972, is the first non-government mental health organization in India and is credited with pioneering work in the field of rehabilitation of persons with mental illness. Locally and nationally, MPA is well renowned for its contributions to the field of community mental health, particularly in the area of about mental health issues. Marks 50 years of the distinguished service, an achievement that the Medico Pastoral Association wishes to celebrate with everyone. One of the programs being organized to celebrate this Golden Jubilee year is a series of lectures that will be conducted every month. Today, we are delighted to have Dr. Sanjeev Jain, retired Senior Professor of Psychiatry at NIMHANS, to deliver the 18th lecture in this series. This lecture will be followed by a brief question and answer session to be moderated by the session chair, Dr. Matthew Verghese. Now, I would like to request our residents to lead the group in prayer. Over to you.
We shall overcome, we shall overcome, we shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. We are not afraid, we are not afraid, we are not afraid today. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. We are not alone, we are not alone, we are not alone today. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we are not alone today. The truth will make us free, the truth will make us free, the truth will make us free someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. We'll walk hand in hand, we'll walk hand in hand, we'll walk hand in hand someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. The Lord will see us through, the Lord will see us through, the Lord will see us through someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. We shall all be free, we shall all be free, we shall all be free someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday.
Thank you for the prayer song. Now, I welcome Dr. Ajit B. Bede, Senior Psychiatrist and Honorable Vice President of MPA, who has been associated with MPA for over 2 decades. Sir, I thank you for your presence and request that you welcome the gathering and give an overview of the guest lecture series. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Devika. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to have all of you here on this occasion of the 18th Suvarna Jayanthi lectures. To observe our Golden Jubilee, more than a year ago, we initiated this series of lectures, starting with the guiding spirit of MPA, Professor Mohan Isaac. I hope he will join us today. And we've been having a lecture every month since, as a commemoration of the 50 years that the MPA has completed. Starting as a small band of people interested in mental health, we cannot but pay obeisance to the memory of Dr. Joyce, who got this going with Dr. R.M. Verma, and the support of the Church of South India. The human service rendered by her started as a care for an abandoned nurse after she had had a gynecological issue and then a psychiatric issue to care for her. It became the first halfway home in the country and grew into an organization which, as Devika mentioned, is the first NGO in the field of mental health in India. We ventured into various aspects. MPA for a long time was preoccupied with and catering to suicide prevention, a theme that has been revived in the past couple of decades. And also, more recently, much more active in the field of public awareness of mental illness. Over these year and a half, we've covered various aspects of mental health, including the history of the MPA itself, history of non-governmental organizations in the field of mental health. We've largely had professionals come and speak to us on different aspects of the mind-body relationship, parenting, disciplining of children, so-called disciplining of children. All these aspects have been dealt with. And it's time we pay heed to something which we have not yet spoken of. And we are indeed very privileged to have with us the National Authority on the inheritance of mental illness, the part that genetics plays in the genesis of mental disorders. Sanjeev, it's a great pleasure to invite you to give us this lecture today. And I would also like to welcome all the members of MPA itself, apart from members of the general public who are here. Particularly our president, Dr. Joseph George, who's taken the trouble to join us online from Serampore. Thank you, Dr. Joseph George. I am making this welcome speech on behalf of our Secretary, Alphonse, and the chairman of our public awareness.
Just coming 1 minute. When
Please
he has
come.
taken 2 hours, we can also take half a.
Right, just
10
mute yourself if
seconds.
you don't mind, even as you join us. Yeah, and Dr. Rohini Rajiv, who chairs our Committee for Public Awareness, Publications, and Academics. Finally, last but not the least, as the cliche goes, I'd like to invite our chair, Dr. Matthew Varghese. Incidentally, from all of us, Matthew, a slightly belated happy birthday to you. I know it was yesterday, but we'll wish you today. Matthew, as you know, is also a retired professor from NIMHANS. I must say that we should not speak of Sanjeev only as a retired professor because he's an emeritus professor at NIMHANS. Matthew will be chairing our session today. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, Rohini and Devika. Devika, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Now I request Dr. Matthew Varghese, Senior Professor of Psychiatry and Adjunct Professor at St. John's Medical College in Bangalore, who is the chairperson of the Therapy and Program Committee and also a member of the Managing Committee of MPA, to introduce the guest speaker, chair the session, and also facilitate the discussion and moderate the Q&A session after the lecture. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Devika. It's a pleasure to introduce my very old friend and colleague, Professor Sanjeev Jain, who I've known ever since both of us joined NIMHANS way back in 1981. So it's been a more than 40 years acquaintance. So Sanjeev, as you heard, is the Senior Professor of Psychiatry and currently the Emeritus Professor since he retired last year. He's been working through his life at NIMHANS. Other than in adult psychiatry, he's been working with genetics of mental disorders. He's been heading the molecular genetics lab, which is established mainly by him. And he also worked in the area of rehabilitation because he used to look after all the patients who were in rehabilitation centers all around NIMHANS. And there are many rehabilitation centers which are all around NIMHANS. He used to be looking after them for a long time. And he's also associated with many agencies which are known to have homeless mentally ill. Chittadama is one, with which he's associated. And he's also associated with the Banyan and Balm in Chennai. So he has an enduring interest in the care of people with chronic mental illness. And I think over the years, he has had many, many patients referred to the MPA. So his other interest is the history of psychiatry. And then he's looked at the history of psychiatry and actually taken exhibitions of the history of different mental hospitals all over the country, together with our other friend, Dr. Alok Sareen. So at some stage, you might want to look at the history of mental disorders, which Sanjeev is again well known for. So you might be also able to see some of the historical aspects in the Heritage Museum at Nimans, which Sanjeev contributed quite a lot to. He's also the adjunct faculty at the National Center for Biological Sciences, the NCBS, with whom Sanjeev and then some of us have done a lot of work in the area of genetics and molecular genetics in the last 20 odd years. As a doctor, he was educated for his bachelor's course in the Maulana Azad Medical College in New Delhi. And after that, he came over, as I mentioned, in 1981 and joined Nimans. So a long career. Sanjeev, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you for this talk. And let's hear you for the next, say, whatever, 40 minutes or so, and then we'll take questions after that. Over to you, Sanjeev.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Ajit and Devika and all the others for inviting me here. MPA has been something one has heard of ever since one came to Bangalore in the 80s. And so it's particularly interesting for me to be here. I've been, as Matthew said, I have lots of friends and, staying there for a long time now. Are my slides visible?
Not yet.
Not yet. Yeah. Start. Now?
Yeah, put it on full screen.
Yeah. Is that right?
Now it's good.
Right. So, as Matthew mentioned, we both joined with Ajit as being a couple of years senior to us. We all joined for our studies at NIMHANS together, and we've known each other since. I think Mohan Isaac was a young faculty member at that time. So all our links go back a really long way. Now, of course, madness is a common disease. Now, we know mental illness is a common disorder. It's actually more common than hypertension or diabetes. And about 1 to 2% of the people get affected by it at any time. We know much less about it than we do about these other disorders. And this is just a list of fairly noticeable people in the public space who we know have had mental illness, from King George III to Samuel Beckett to Praveen Babi to Virginia Woolf, Günter Grass, Kurt Gödel, etc., etc. Many of them have got Nobel Prizes. Many of them have been kings and rulers. Many of them have been actors. Many have been writers. And but basically, it just shows that mental illness can affect everybody, and it can affect all of us or each one of us. And the great William Shakespeare, as usual, pontificated half a millennium ago that great wits and madness have thin partitions. In India, of course, it's of course very mysterious condition because it's a source of mystery, of wonder, of hope, and care and sarcasm all roll into one, as you can see by the public, by the so-called film, movies and popular media. It goes through the entire spectrum of how mental illness is viewed by society at large. And of course, in many other domains, it's also used as an insult, especially with our politicians and things like that. So what is it that makes it so intriguing? Now, of course, the intrigue is basically because we do not understand. We do not have a public acceptance without shame of mental disorder. And as Roy Porter, an eminent historian of psychiatry, pointed out, it will be a long time before we accept that, because what has happened over the last 100 to 200 years, ever since doctors started looking after the mental illness and subdivided into syndromes and classifications and medical disorders, the mythical value of madness has gradually been eroded. It becomes just like another infectious disease like COVID, which is to be feared, but can be understood and vaccines can be developed. Before that, when insanity spoke, society listened because the madman is supposed to also possess a kind of visionary truths. But once institutionalized or medicalized, madness was robbed of this allure and was reduced to mainly unreason. Now that is understandable because that's what we deal with. So what is our job as psychiatrists? We want to understand why do people develop mental illness and how can we help, the essential jobs of any doctor. Psychiatry, therefore, is a branch of medicine. We all trained for several years in this, and medicine is broadly based on the principles of science, almost entirely so. And the underlying belief, of course, is that scientific processes like that of Vesalius and Harvey started out with the discovery of dissection and the microscope and the stethoscope and the EEG machines can somehow explain the occurrence of disease. And this would be universal. And these explanations would be universal. They would apply to the whole of human species. And therefore, one could develop interventions to manage these, which would be applicable to all human beings. Of course, we run into a big wall as far as mental or psychological issues are concerned, because it is still not decided whether the mind actually arises out of material processes. And if it does, how would it matter if our so-called mental space was entirely a material process and just another aspect of the physical world around us? To understand this, of course, the medical doctors have extended their so-called vision from the ears and eyes down to ecology and the electron microscope, and to explore what is this nature of the human experience and biology. And psychiatry, therefore, remains an abstract discipline without a specific organ. We broadly believe it's to do with the mind, but the mind itself is not confined or constrained by the brain. So as it's an abstract notion of the mind, and therefore it's a very radical branch of medicine, which creates its own problems. What have we understood over the last few years? And as you can understand, having spent 40 years, the few years is a kind of variable definition. But what we seem to understand is that mental illnesses have multiple factors and multiple biological systems which arise within a single disease. We were often told by our teachers at NIMHANS itself, it's very odd that in schizophrenia, you can check the heart rate, you can check the bowel, you can check the fingerprints, you can check the eye blood pressure. Everything will be subtly different as a group, but you can never pin down as to what is the cause and what is the effect. So all the biological systems of the body are affected in some subtle way to produce these disease syndromes that we identify in the clinic. These perhaps arise from an interplay of risk genes and biological factors and environmental factors. Each of them is a field in itself, and we don't really understand that. The definitions that we use are often imprecise. So definitions of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety, OCD change over time. And they're not exactly the same as they were 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And between individuals, there is significant variability. So no two patients behave even approximately alike, most often. We also see that what we call as distinct syndromes are often not so very distinct. There are large overlaps and differences and similarities between syndromes, and the treatments are very limited. So it's very essential that we understand the science behind these disorders so that we can basically invent new treatments, which we haven't done for quite some time. Now, so therefore, discussions basically with Matthew and Vivek and lots of other colleagues at NIMHANS, we realized from our clinical work that many patients or many situations, the mental illness or traits of the mental illness or some aspects of it arise well before the patient comes to the clinic. So there's a pre-morbid phase, and which is perhaps slightly different for different people with different genetic backgrounds. There's a prolonged prodrome of months or years, and then people develop a so-called psychosis or a mental illness, and some of them recover quite well and they become quite all right. Some of them are left with deficits, and some of them have recurrent causes, keep on having attacks. We obviously, if we want to understand the biology, we would have to go back all the way to this stage and not just confine ourselves to this. The outcomes, as we all know, can vary very widely. The person on top has been confined to a charpai by his mother because he was disturbed and they had no way to keep him, and the institutions don't exist. And person below is Kurt Gödel, who got the Nobel Prize for Physics. Looked at another way, Kurt Gödel died in a lecture hall in Princeton University with schizophrenia in America at the Institute of Advanced Studies because he had no family to look after him. Whereas a person above has a mother who's looking after him. And whether the outcome of the person above is better or the person below remains a social question as to what are the factors that led to Kurt Gödel's death all by himself and which allow the person above to still be cared for. So what is it that we are trying to do in genetics? We want to understand whether there's an inherited component to disease. If so, to what extent? Can we identify the genetic variants? What are the environmental influences that may have an important role in explaining this? And how do they interact with each other? And that's a broad overview. Even if we could answer a fragment of these questions, we would consider ourselves quite lucky. To do this, we have to understand all these other things which are on the other half of the screen. We can understand that by doing genetic linkage, by studying families and seeing how genes get transmitted from one to the other. We have to understand how these genetic processes affect neurodevelopment, because like I mentioned, that the antecedents of the disease are often quite early. 1/3 of our genes are expressed only before birth, and especially in the brain. So many times the defects, the genetic variations that may occur or differences may occur, may only affect the brain development while in utero. We also have to understand gene expression studies because people are often doing quite well all their lives. And the illness starts and then they're never quite the same again. So we have to understand how genetic expression changes over time, the multi-organ involvement, which I've already alluded to. There are growth deviations. So people with mental illness who develop severe mental illness often have some differences in the way the brain maintains itself in terms of its volume or its connectivity or its function over time. There are obviously some seasonal issues. Some people with bipolar disorder relapse every year. There's a kind of a winter birth excess. So there's a complex issue with the weather patterns. Most illnesses will begin at mid-adolescence or early adult life. 15 to 25 is the primary age of onset. And why should this be timed at that point? It still remained unclear. Once the disease develops, once the syndrome develops, there is subtle kinds of neurodegeneration, not big enough for us to pick up on contemporary scans. But there is also a lot of regeneration and neuronal repair, which is what we try to achieve with our treatment. The bigger question, of course, is why does it occur and persist in human beings? And why is it that our drugs are so useful? To understand this better, we have to go back to simple things like most illnesses run in families, as do many traits, as does the shape of the nose or the shape of the hair or various other attributes. Every family knows that this newborn child looks like a distant uncle, or the two siblings, although they are not twins, are as like as peas in a pod. So it turns out that you can measure the relative risk of a family member if they had another relative with any of these diseases. And turns out if you have a relative with hypertension, you're twice as likely as the general population. If you have diabetes, you're about 5 times more likely. And if you have schizophrenia in a sibling, you're 10 times more likely than the general population to have this disease. This obviously much less than the other known genetic syndromes like Duchenne muscular dystrophy or Huntington disease, where the risk climbs dramatically. But it should also be understood that these risks could be inflated for completely different reasons. On the right side is an old paper by a very prominent psychiatric researcher called Peter McGuffin, who calculated the risk of being a doctor if you had one parent as a doctor, both parents in a doctor, and one sibling as a doctor. Turns out the relative risk of being a doctor was 61 times that of the general population, way more than that of schizophrenia or multiple sclerosis. So one might as well look at the genetics of being a doctor rather than look at the genetics of schizophrenia. But we do realize that the risk of being a doctor is actually mainly environmental and perhaps not genetic. After all, medicine is a relatively new condition. Schizophrenia has been there with us forever. So these factors in the social and the biological space make the genetics for psychiatric disease slightly more complex. Now, the first studies were done in the beginning of the century, because although one had the vague idea that illness ran in families, databases or the kind of family studies did not exist in the world to allow this to be evaluated in great detail. This happened mainly because of the effects of the Bismarck and workhouse health systems in Northern Europe. So many countries developed very elaborate case notes and case records and a canton system of healthcare, so you could follow families up. So these questions were answered by Ernst Rudin, who took over the Institute of Psychiatry in Germany in the early part of the 20th century, who established that if one had an affective disorder, the relatives had 30 to 35% chance of becoming ill. And therefore, it was quite evident that these had a strong genetic component. It was also very clear that although Mendel had postulated his rules only about half a century earlier, it was families with two healthy parents had 7% affected children, whereas both parents affected should have 25% affectation status, but that was nowhere near the case. So the recessive mode was not very clear. With unaffected parent, again, it had to be excluded. And lots of mathematical models were built, depending on whether you had one parent ill or both parents ill or a sibling ill. And these estimates were calculated in great detail. And they felt that a finite number of genes was probably likely to do this, and that the two major disorders which had been defined by April Krepin at the Institute of Psychiatry just a decade earlier, that's dementia precox and mood disorders, were sufficiently distinct to form two separate syndromes. So affective disorders and dementia precox are inherited separately, and therefore we have this understanding for almost 100 years that schizophrenia and bipolar disorders are two distinct disorders. Of course, the male-female ratios were almost identical, so there was no sex-linked transmission. So these broad ideas were in place by the early part of the century. Now, since we wanted to start the work here in India, we wanted to look at this right from the bottom up. So we did a small study many years ago to look at whether bipolar disorder and schizophrenia actually are apart. And we found that although there is a significant overlap too, so that the morbid risk for depression is high for major depression is high in both relatives of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, although the other way around seemed to be slightly more specific, although morbid risk was quite high. We also wanted to look at whether earlier the age of onset, was the illness more severe and was it more familial? In clinical medicine, it's always an idea that people who develop the illness early have a higher genetic risk, like with diabetes. Juvenile diabetes has a higher genetic risk than late onset diabetes. Juvenile hypertension has a higher risk than late onset hypertension. So we want to see if the same model applies to bipolar disease. And sure enough, we found that if the illness was occurring below the age of 21, you were at higher risk of getting bipolar disease in the relatives than if you had a late onset disease. But they had higher rates of all affective disorders, but there were higher rates of both depression and bipolar disorder with young onset bipolar disorder. What was also interesting was that even the siblings who were not ill had certain deficits in their memory and in the neuropsychological function. So this was very intriguing because to our mind, it seemed that the manifestation of a psychiatric disorder was very different from the risk of the psychiatric disorder. The risk could be shared amongst the family members, but only a few of them would become ill. So to understand the genetics, one would therefore have to study lots of family members to understand how this genetic risk actually manifested itself in the others. So about 20 years ago or 25 years ago, it was decided almost all over the world simultaneously after as the advances in genetics picked up, and one knew that one would basically be able to decipher the entire human genome, not just the human genome, but genome of many, all the species on Earth. That to understand this, one would have to combine the skills in epidemiology that have been picked up over the last several decades, including work at NIMHANS by Professor Kapoor and Mohan Isaac and the others, with genomics. So genetic epidemiology had to be combined with the clinical epidemiology to really get to the bottom of this. Unfortunately, for various, we never had the money or the capacity anywhere in the world to do large-scale genetic analysis of the patients we're studying in the clinic, in the clinical space, but we'll get there. So the idea was to look at how different genes occur in different populations, how does migration, mutation, and selection of the humans impact disease, and identify families multiple affected, and these could be a pool of certain variants, and do also population-based studies. It was evident, again, about 20 years ago, that if you genotype enough people, you could identify the variants, and you could look at people with particular variants who developed various kinds of syndromes in the clinic. It could be cancers, it could be cardiac disease, it could be irritable bowel syndrome, it could also be autism, schizophrenia, or bipolar disorder. So there was a need to define and identify the disease syndromes well enough, and also understand what were the environmental interactions that produce this. So both the genes and the environment needed to be studied. To put it another way, the idea was that lots of genes will produce defects of some kind or the other. They will produce some changes in both either the brain biology or behavior, like attention deficits or circadian rhythm irritability. So people prefer to sleep during the day or sleep at night. They could also manifest in subtle changes in the brain structure, like white matter anomalies or things like that, or may have altered motivation and reward systems. Everybody who is born with these genetic variations would obviously have a plastic brain, and as they went through life, they would be exposed to various stimuli. And it is only a small amount of people in whom the genetic risk would actually become manifest as a bipolar disorder. Most of the others would continue to remain more or less well. So what we see as a specific syndrome may actually be a dimension of risk in the family. And this could be understood by understanding their subjective and objective experience, the neuropsychology, electrophysiology, outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the broad ideas with which we started earlier. And this is borne out by even more recent work, where we find that in a group of 200 families that we have collected, each one of them with more than 3 affected members, almost half the families have syndromes across the spectrum. So you can see here that families with substance use disorders, bipolar disorders, schizophrenia, OCD, Alzheimer's disease, complex severe mental illness in which they have symptoms of all of them, they all cluster together. In the same family, you may get 2 or 3 people with different syndromes. So the rates of mental illness in these families were 2 to 10 times higher than in the general population. Matthew and others had already done the National Mental Health Survey. So we knew what the rates of mental illness in the general public were. Turns out in these families, if you counted everybody, there was a 2 to 10 times higher risk of mental illness. And therefore, one should be able to pick this up with modern methods. However, there were some families, about 40%, in which ill members shared the same syndrome. Most often, they were ones with addiction, because addiction seems to run in families, with a combination of both genetics and behavioral being shared. But for most other syndromes of severe mental illness like OCD and schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, families tended to have many of these disorders in the same family, in the group of relatives. So the early start, of course, in the 1980s, with the moment genetic mapping became available, was to see whether one could identify by looking at parents and children and all their relatives to see whether those who were ill in some way shared a particular fragment of the genome, which could then be understood to look at genes. Now, this was obviously very laborious. You had to identify the families, and the first families that were looked at were in the island of in Iceland, because the entire population was being ascertained. So the Icelandic studies were the first one to appear in 1987. Lots of people published papers with larger and larger families. But over time, it became evident that no 2 families matched each other. The clinical symptoms were absolutely identical, but each family gave rise to a separate, when one could detect as a different segment of the genome that was being shared. So this was very confusing, and we really could not go beyond this at a particular point. In the recent past, these researchers have really declined. That has not stopped us, however. As you can see in this family from Canada, there are more than 100 people affected in this single family. They've taken almost 2 decades to collect this family. And the number of people affected is in a single large family can really be a unique resource for understanding the genetics of these disorders. So we were lucky enough, being at NIMHANS, we were contacted by one patient who got slightly happy with the way we looked after the person. And gradually the family started getting all their relatives to us. And turns out that we were able to interview 70 subjects and get history on another 40 or 50. It was a 100-member family, of which 19 people had bipolar disorder, 1 had a major depressive disorder, and 1 recurrent depressive disorder, and 50 were apparently unaffected. These are people on whom we could get DNA on. And we did a DNA analysis, and then we followed it up in the fragment that was shared, we did something called a whole exome sequencing, which identifies variations in each of the genes that are present inside that patch of DNA. And we were able to find 2 genes, which could perhaps be linked to bipolar disorder, but this has not been reported anywhere else, so we don't know whether we are actually right or wrong. And that's where it is. So biologically speaking, they may be relevant for this particular family. There are 2 different genes that we could get in this family, coming from 2 different parts of the lineage. It's as you can see, it's consanguineous, but it's a very confined Christian community in southern India. So they tend to marry only within their clan, within their villages, with a few villages that they have. So there's a lot of concentration of genetic risk factors, and whether this finding that we have is a aspect of that interrelatedness or something general, we have no idea at this point in time. Now, the family genetic studies of these disorders therefore started right in the 60s, the moment, and as you can see, the field has been exploding. We have almost 29,000 papers on the genetics of schizophrenia, or psychosis in general, almost 90,000 papers, which is more than those on the genetics of diabetes, but much less than those of cancer. Why don't we have enough studies on cancer as much as that of cancer? Because cancer has a tissue that we can cut open, we can put a needle, we can do a biopsy, and we understand much better what the biology of cancer is. So, but we do not have any models to understand the actual biology of schizophrenia or psychosis in general, and therefore we are handicapped by that aspect. So these kind of studies go on, and we also keep on studying these. I think the lab has more than 150 publications on various aspects of genetics. But our more recent paper tried to look at some of these families, like with 4 or 5 people who are affected, and you analyze their exomes. Exomes are the part of the genome that is actually converted into a protein. All human beings have around 20,000 or 22,000 genes, the same as most mammals. Dogs, sheep, cattle, cats, rats, mice, all have around 22,000 genes. But we express almost 80,000 proteins because, but when some of these proteins go bad, the body really suffers, so that they cause very severe disease. So when you do exome analysis, we are hoping to pick up certain changes in certain parts of the biology of the person that could possibly impair brain function. So when we looked at all these genes, we found that 1/3 of the genes that we were detecting as being damaged in these people who had mental illness were also seen in other diseases that were actually affecting just the brain. So OMIM is an online Mendelian inheritance in man. It's a database maintained by the Harvard or Johns Hopkins universities, which indicates all the diseases for which we know a genetic cause. And so 1/3 of the genes that we detected were involved in diseases that were already known, but were usually known to have severe intellectual deficiency or brain development disorders. The changes that we detected were often of a milder kind, So our proposition is, our theory is that people with mental illness have very subtle defects in the way the brains are being developed at certain level. Because if they had the more severe variation, for example, in this particular gene, all these genes which are marked with arrows cause severe cerebellar atrophy of the cerebellum and motor dysfunction. But the one that we get in our patient is quite a distance away from this, and it is in this end of the protein, and perhaps it produces a subtler change in the brain, and therefore it allows the person to live and become an adult without much of a problem. But it is causing a subtle change in the way the brain works. Most of these are not pathogenic in the primary syndrome. Most were private to the family. So each family had its own group of these variants. And it's obviously very difficult to generalize because all the studies are still only on 40 families. There was an overrepresentation of abnormalities of the brain and the neck, and there is an increased burden in the genes that relate to brain biology. So what is it that we learn about this? We learn from that most of the syndromes that we talk about, like schizophrenia, autism, ADHD, etc., are actually shared across all these disorders. There is nothing specific of one syndrome or the other, as we can detect at the moment. It is also quite clear that despite our genetic diversity, for example, the same thing has been looked at in China, that the genetic structure of the risk of schizophrenia is almost same in Chinese populations as it is in the European populations. So that makes it very interesting because for the first time, you can compare, despite all the differences in human behavior and size and shape and color, that you actually are finding something common in the risk of mental illness across the world. And what we have been able to do the world over in the last less than a decade, that the sample size of these studies have now increased from hundreds to tens of thousands. But most of these are between mainly European populations, and there are no South Asian samples of this size at the moment. And we hope to correct that in the next half a decade or so. But what's important about this slide, it's slightly technical, but the issue is that the risk of bipolar disorder also correlates with the genetic factors that control sleepiness, morningness, how many hours you sleep in a week, are you likely to be more often sleepless, are you likely to have unstable mood in general, how much have you studied, do you drink excessively, drinks per week, the age at beginning smoking, and cigarettes per day. So large amount of what we think is absolutely normal behavior, like are you an early morning person or a late night person? Are you prone to temper? When did you start smoking? So all these normal variations in human behavior are also overlapping with the risk of bipolar disease. And that's a very important idea to keep in mind, that the risk of mental illness may be no different from the normal variation of human beings. Okay, more than 90% of genetic variants seem to influence bipolar disorder, but also estimated to influence educational attainment. So it's very, the risk of mental illness may overlap with a large number of other so-called human behaviors. Now, this is true not just of genetics, it's also true for brain structures. And this is a very large study produced by one of our colleagues, Professor Paul Thompson, who points out that it doesn't matter whether you have ADHD, a bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, alcohol use disorder, or even OCD or epilepsy, the changes in the brain are almost overlapping in which region of the brain they affect. So both from the genetic end and from the organ end, we seem to be getting a convergence that there are basic fundamental biologies that are at play, which cause, as I mentioned right in the beginning, that there is some amount of cortical gray matter thinning. There is some amount of atrophy in the brain, which is now detectable by these very advanced MRI machines. And there is a tendency for all these diseases to have some kinds of neurodegeneration in addition to the neurodevelopmental risk that I mentioned earlier. Now, it's not just genes. So this is as part of our ongoing work with Matthew and others. We also looked at what happens when in these families, because they have multiple people ill, also have higher levels of poverty, have higher levels of domestic violence, have higher incidence of alcohol use, and higher incidence of what we call adverse childhood events. So it turns out that in our samples who had become mentally ill, about 2/3 of the sample had experienced adverse events frequently enough. So not only had they been at genetic risk, they had also had a higher than expected number of negative events in their early childhood and adolescence. And this was brought forward their age at onset of illness, especially for alcoholism and for OCD, to a much earlier onset. But childhood adversity, even in those with low genetic risk, could precipitate a mental illness. So the genetic risk and the environmental factors both seem to have complex roles. They could add on to the effects of each other, but childhood adversity alone could also cause a significant increase in the risk of mental illness. So how exactly genes and environment interact is something that we are researching, and I won't be going into that today, but we have some very interesting data to show how genetic changes can persist over a lifetime with childhood adversity and childhood abuse. So ultimately, it turns out that many of these disorders, whether it's mood and psychotic disorders, whether it's anorexia nervosa or OCD or major depression or autism, ADHD or tuberous sclerosis, they're all linked to each other. And at this point in time, we can identify almost, this list is a bit old, of 109 loci. It's now almost 400, which basically cover almost half our genetic material. So almost half the genes that we have, subtle variations in those may bump up our risk for schizophrenia or mood disorder by a factor of 2 to 3%, nothing more than that. So that we are quite clear that there is no massive increase in the risk of mental disorders. It's there, but we can't detect it at the moment. So at the end of it, we now feel that all the disorders that we treat in psychiatry are actually linked to each other, and it's some kind of a risk factors, so that increased risk, the susceptibility genes can vary. The kinds of overlaps that you get will produce one syndrome or the other, and you can have either a schizophrenia or a bipolar disorder depending on the overlaps that you get. This happens because these kind of combinations, these specific gene effects which can affect a particular pathway or a particular network can be detected. They can be combinations of protective and at-risk alleles, because in many families that we see, that we have been studying for a long time, we find that the next generation or the generation after is often completely free of mental illness, and they're actually doing all quite well. So the same combinations can sometimes, or some combinations can be protective at times, and some can increase risk. Now, that is really the genomic shuffling that occurs with reproduction itself. And therefore, we need to also find what are the protective factors in the genetic material. It could also be that what we are detecting is an aggregation, is some random aggregations that is just literally a play of the dice. And so people are just unlucky enough to have a combination that is increasing risk. There are also epigenetic points of vulnerability, because the brain, as we are all taught in medical school, is not very plastic. You can't replace a neuron. A neuron scarring of the brain is permanent. Neurons die and they are very difficult to replace, if at all. But even then, they are replaced in a small, slow manner every few months, because otherwise, how would the brain actually work? You have to retain your memories, you have to transfer memories as you grow older. So there are points of vulnerability in this process in which the brain is repairing itself. Why at those points, stresses can shift the brain to another track altogether. But we still have a long way to go before we can understand how tissues and cells change into behavior. Now, this kind of, so what we have made some progress, but our ultimate understanding of the genetics of this is still we still cannot explain that if no two families are similar, and if the genetic markers are over 1,000 genomes, or half of 50% of our genome, then why are the syndromes so restricted? Why is it that we can pick up schizophrenia or bipolar so simply by just a few weeks of training in psychiatry? Why are drugs, so few of them, so effective? Salts like lithium, valproate, carbamazepine, olanzapine, clozapine. It's just a handful of drugs that we use, but they seem to be treating all these disorders. How is this convergence occurring in the brain is something that we still need to understand. Now, this obviously is something that has worried human beings for a long time, because like I said in the beginning, mental illness is perhaps the most mysterious of all afflictions and the most feared. And over the last 150 years, ever since Darwin elucidated his theory of evolution and given the long history of human beings in cultivating plants and animals, so-called culture, it is an obvious attempt that one could improve the human race. And the biggest problem of the human race are all these things: intelligence, race, war, migration, mental deficiency, intelligence, medical problems, insanity, crime, education. For all these things, it was thought in the early 20th century that genetics would provide an answer, because, of course, we had several thousand years of knowing how to breed animals and how to cultivate plants, and perhaps we could apply, with the new knowledge of genetics, one could apply it more scientifically. The same Ernest Rudin who did the first family studies and established the percentages of risk, he ordered eugenic legislation for genetics, and more than about 500,000 people were sterilized in Germany alone. And the laws were put in place in America and in large parts of Europe and in Japan. And they also formed the basis of family planning in India. And Rudin's or these ideas about the genetics of mental illness were critical to their understanding of how society has to be improved and how the burden of the mentally ill has to be reduced. So a large number of mentally ill were killed, mainly because they had the right percentage of relatives who were ill, or their illness was too severe. This was opposed by many psychiatrists, and some of them will be familiar to you, maybe familiar to you: Karl Jaspers, who became a theologian, and Karl Bonhoeffer, who gave the concept of psychosis. Bonhoeffer was specifically a very devout Christian, and he supported, according to my understanding, a particularly Christian humanistic tradition of interpreting the faith, in which human beings, irrespective of their race, ethnicity, religious background, still had to be treated with appropriate respect and with a human concern. He had to pay a price, and because he objected, his son, Klaus Bonhoeffer, who had joined the resistance, was killed, and the pastor, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, was also killed under Nazi. From my other reading, which unfortunately I couldn't track, I think some of the influence of Dietrich Bonhoeffer was instrumental in the initial setting up of MPA in the 50s and 60s, when some of these same pastors and priests from Europe came here and started talking about looking after the disabled. So the genetics, improperly understood or improperly applied, can be quite dangerous. And therefore, we need to understand the genetics within the social construct of how we look at psychiatric illness. So in this period, they killed almost 1 million people because they had schizophrenia or mental illness, and many more were sterilized. And because they believed that they had found the genetics of schizophrenia and therefore could prevent it from future generations. It never worked. And the incidence of rate of schizophrenia in post-war Germany continued to be as high and actually increased after the war, perhaps related to the environmental stress. So genetics as of now cannot be used in a kind of a preventive or a definitive way to understand treatments as such. Mainly because this scientist called J.B.S. Haldane had predicted way back in 1931 that if you look at traits of height or weight, then you can correlate anything with anything. So including education, including intelligence, including risk of mental illness. If you follow the family studies, then you are forced to understand things that certain people will be at risk. And if you give it all to the eugenics or the politicians, they will just say, let's get rid of everybody who's at risk because they are an economic burden, because it's too expensive to treat mental illness, and let's get rid of the problem at its very base by avoiding these people to be born or letting them die early. So a lot of the genetic research that is going on is still uncritical about this, and that's something we need to understand. So in the last 25 years, what did happen, and what gave rise to the work that Matthew and I started is that Erwin Schrödinger wrote this very famous book called What is Life and What is Mind and What is Matter. And because he could predict that the DNA revolution would occur, one had the basis for discovering DNA. In the same time, in the 50s and 60s, all these scientists, Watson, Crick, and the others who discovered the DNA, and the people below, Eccles, Katz, Euler, and Axelrod, who basically discovered how a brain cell works. Now, once you have discovered the genes at one end and how the body is organized, including a brain cell, and the ultrastructure of how a brain actually works through chemicals and membranes and transporters, combining the two took a few years. So so now we know that all the same graphs, that a biochemical change occurs much earlier in life, then the cells start getting damaged. And when the cells have become damaged to a particular space, then the clinical symptoms start. So if you really want to repair something, you have to go back to early in life. Now, how do we do this? Because we understand that all these processes can occur at different cells. The risk period is the first, let's say, 12 years of life or whenever. That's when the brain gets developed and myelinates itself. It develops a prefrontal cortex when we develop our thinking capacities, and the inhibitory synapses when we learn so-called wisdom. Then you get illnesses of various kinds, which are reflected basically in brain biology, and the psychosis, or very late in life, dementia starts, and which gives rise to chronic disability because these patterns of growth and repair are somehow modified. To do this, you will have to understand everything from inside a cell to the networks. And therefore, one should be able to do it by developing a synthetic brain in a lab so that you can understand how these processes happen, because we'll never be able to biopsy a brain. We'll never be able to, for absolutely correct reasons, interfere with a working brain. So you have to develop a kind of a copy of a brain, and which is what will be necessary, so that you can understand how the disease starts at various points in life. This particular slide refers to just Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, but the process is exactly the same in schizophrenia and SMI. There are changes in the proteins, there are changes in the way the cell is responding to stress, there's changes in the way it uses up oxygen, the way it uses synaptic transmission, and the way it uses signaling. And all these factors are also seen in people with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, or with autism, or with OCD. So ultimately, we will have to shift our understanding, not just from the genetics, which we may understand in the next few decades, but to really a deep understanding of how the brain works and creates our minds. So what we do right now as clinical psychiatrists is we interview patients using language, and we just try to put them into a syndrome or the other. We sometimes test their cognitive functions, especially if we think they have dementia, but actually we check it all the time. We check it with their school performance, we check it with their academic working, we see whether they are able to continue work or not, etc., etc. This obviously depends on the way the brain synchronizes itself, but under that is how the brain wires itself and how it signals within itself, and that itself is dependent on various biological processes. So at this point, psychiatry is only in the first level, but we at NIMHANS, with all our friends and colleagues, decided that we should do research at every possible level in psychiatry. And that is the ADBS project, which Matthew and I were involved in setting up, so that we are able to not just do the genomics, but do it all the way up here, so that we can shift from a clinical practice to cohorts, to biology, to all these sciences, and hopefully within the next decade or two, have a very precise way, have a much more precise way of treating mental illness, so that these old drugs that we invented 50 years ago are supplanted by much more precise molecules, or in a much more informed manner as to when we should give these drugs and for how long. So there are many, many needles across many haystacks. There may be multiple pathways, many of these may intersect. We don't understand how they are distributed all across the world. Some of them may actually be clan or family or region specific. The brain also mutates. because new genes can occur entirely inside the brain, the same way as you get cancer in a particular lung tissue or a breast tissue. The brain also accumulates mutations, but because it can't divide, it can't go very far, but it can increase the risk of other disease. So we will need to focus on our basic biology to understand and improve our clinical experience, which is entirely in the psychological and social space. Now, why is this important? Because as I kept on mentioning, if you look at the history of psychiatry, once chlorpromazine was invented and Community Care Acts came, the caring community and allowed places like the MPA or the Richmond Fellowship or all the other halfway homes to exist, because the mental hospitals could actually be shut down and provide care. But we have not introduced any new drugs since 1952. And what you see all over the world is that the rates of institution in non-medical institutions like jails or beggars' homes is actually increased. So the total number of people in institutions has now become the same, except that they are not in mental hospitals and outside the medical gaze, and they are completely marginalized. So that with this withdrawal of medical supervision, there's a marked increase in mortality and morbidity of those with mental illness. In the last 15 years, people with mental illness are dying earlier than they were 15 years before. So as the medical attention has withdrawn, their long-time life or conditions of the mental ill has actually deteriorated in the recent past. And unless we discover what causes and if we can invent new drugs, and that will not be possible without more investment in biology, I'm afraid this scenario may continue. A prime example is here, whereas in India, this is a mental health atlas of 2011. We haven't produced one since then, but India has, let's say, around 30,000 beds, and which is quite low. But for the large number of what we talk about is actually unknown. Community residential facility is unknown. In community residential facility is unknown. And we are looking after just 2,500 chronic patients in the whole of India as far public investments are concerned. Although we have 100 times or 200 times more psychiatrists than we had in 1960 when the MPAs, when the idea of the MPA actually came up. There were less than 50 psychiatrists in India in 1960, and now there are more than 10,000. So unless we integrate biology into our understanding of the social psychiatry and the other way around, we won't get very far. So what is it that we need to understand? What we are calling mental illness may actually not be an illness at all. It's just a normal variation. And that is why you see this big debate in the West about neurodiversity, that there are different ways of being. And being mentally ill is just one of those ways. It need not be a disease in the classical sense. In the classical sense, mean like tuberculosis or diabetes or hypertension. Even those may not be disease, but at least it's not like tuberculosis and COVID. So what doctors think of a disease may need to be altered when we look at these kinds of disorders. To understand the disease differences, they may be too subtle and specific to be analyzed by existing technology. So we need stem cell models, we need synthetic brains, we need artificial intelligence or MRIs and imaging to understand the subtle changes that are causing mental illness. Whatever methods we have are simply too imprecise for us to figure that out. There may be marked population differences so that the ways a diagnosis is made or the way diagnoses are picked up may differ across cultures, and the signal noise ratio may be quite different. And of course, one must remember that we are not the only animals with brains. Brains have occurred across life forms in many species, from earthworms and flies to all of us. And the basic chemistry of brains is exactly the same. So why is it that human beings have acquired certain changes in their brain biology to increase the risk of brain disease is something that we really need to understand. And therefore, Shakespeare's ideas are equally true of biology. It may be equally true of genes and biology as speculated by the human experience, so that the differences between so-called normal and abnormal aspects of biology may be as close as what we fail to detect even in psychological or social spaces. And to understand all this, sorry, I think I've gone back. Yeah. So prime example of this is this photograph, which is the so-called Solvay Conference of 1927, which was called to discuss the outcomes of the theory of relativity and quantum electrodynamics, which basically overturned, heralded the new physics and the new physics that allows us to use Zoom and phones and things like that. So of this big conference, 17 people in this conference were awarded a Nobel Prize. And 7 of those 17 either had a mental illness themselves, schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, or had a sibling or a child with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. That means that they were theoretically at the same genetic risk for schizophrenia or bipolar disease. So the fact that this whole, group of people had such a fairly high concentration of reasonably high concentration of those with mental illness or those carrying the genetic risk of mental illness may also hide a message. And therefore, we need to understand that mental illness may not be exactly the way we think it is. And as Spike Milligan, one of my favorite authors, pointed out, blessed are the cracked, for they let in the light. And to understand the biggest ignorance we have now is how does our brain create a conscious experience? How does our brain actually create a mind? And by understanding the experiences and the biology of those with mental illness, we may ultimately be able to answer that question. Thank you very much for your attention, and thanks.
नहीं, see, this
Thank you
is
once again for
definitely a
the
very personal decision. मैं क्या बोल सकता हूँ? I can't tell you this.
Thanks,
way or that
Sanjeev.
way.
Hi.
But,
If you can unshare, then we can get back to
Yeah,
some
you have to
discussion
work
here
it out because
for the 5-10 minutes.
the only
People who want to ask questions can unmute and ask, or put up your hands so that you can see your hand up.
Dr. Matthew, may I?
Please go ahead, Dr. Joseph.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Now, Doc, thank you so much for this very important topic that you discussed. Genetic factor. The genetic inherited genetic factor in mental disorders. Now, my question is, knowing that there is this genetic factor, my question is, does that also become very negative, at least to some people who all the time thinking about maybe I have schizophrenia because my mother had schizophrenia, my grandmother had schizophrenia. So it is continually looking at that family tree. A lot of people do not have live symptoms. They live with fears. How do you look at that, doctor?
That's a very, very important issue, because lots of families ask us exactly the same question. No, my son has schizophrenia. Can he get married? Can he have children? I have my relative who has schizophrenia. So to my mind, that's an entirely a social question, because the risk of schizophrenia is exactly the same as diabetes or hypertension. So if my grandfather had diabetes and my father has diabetes and I have diabetes, would I tell my children not to marry because they have diabetes? No, medically speaking or genetically speaking, diabetes and mental illness behave in almost the same way. All other stigma that we attach to this is entirely our own creation. Okay, and as a practicing doctor, the only advice I give most of my patients is that they should be free to live their lives like everybody else, which means they should have the full reproductive rights, they should have full personal rights, and should have the full personal autonomy like everybody else. The fears may be there. We can test it out. In some cases, we can tell them the risk, but that doesn't change anything, because that risk you cannot mitigate unless you have lots and lots of money, and the technology simply doesn't exist. You can't choose at this point children based on a genetic makeup. So but basically the risk, people need to be reassured. Of course, you have to understand that they may be reasonably fearful, but more often than not, it's an unfounded fear.
Thank you so much.
There's a hand raised, Matthew. Rajeshri.
I can't see it.
Rajeshri
Can you see?
Rajeshri Mandla.
Yes, sir. I wanted to ask a question that as a lay person, because my spouse was diagnosed by Alok Sarin. First, we went to PGI Chandigarh. They didn't tell me that my spouse is having bipolar. They continued treatment almost 10 months. Then Amritsar government hospital, they give something, but nobody declared that he is having bipolar. Then everything lost in life, so many things, destruction and all that. Then anyhow, I took my spouse in the name of smoking. Okay, you should smoke less. Then I took him to Alok Sarin because I was associated with JNU, and Professor Imrana Kadir suggested that you should go to Alok Sarin. And then he diagnosed us, and he asked her that you should go to a psychologist also. But after 2.5 years, he was a psychologist was not able to diagnose that he is having dyscalculia also. So then again, he suggested that you should go to an NGO. They have system to assess this. Then finally, we again went to neurology of AIMS. So they did lot of tests, but clearly they didn't tell us what happened. Then again, AIMS psychiatry. Then they tested and they told me that he is bipolar, but he is having dyscalculia also. That's why he is having too much problem, because sometimes 90% of his official work I used to do. And he simply copy mail and then send to his office. But yeah, he was able to do this tour and people dealing with people, though that is also problematic sometimes, but and still he is having smoking and drinking. And to so many doctors, even I took him RML also, Ram Manohar Lohia, but nobody in the world convinced him, and family members, they I don't want to tell that they are some are in UN organization and social sector, but all blame came to me that after marriage it happened.
I see.
And so my question is how it is difficult for doctor to diagnosis, and or why this law is too difficult. If I take a cancer patient to a doctor, so he simply do his job because he is professional. I trust him. But when I take my husband to you, you will ask, अच्छा आप शराब छोड़ोगे कि नहीं, आप स्मोकिंग छोड़ना चाहते हो कि नहीं, आप ट्रीटमेंट लेना चाहते हो कि नहीं, what is your worst condition? If he says no, you will just say him tata bye bye, okay, you live in on your way. So my trouble is because in this in 14 and a half years since it was intercaste marriage, so all of my support system was lost. So and now his family members, they don't believe that there is a problem. तो मूड स्विंग तो सबको होता है, इसका मतलब ये थोड़ी हुआ कि मेडिसिन खाने लगो.
Mhm.
So, and now during this corona, I developed this first moderate this depression, and then I developed more depression, and I was not able to move from my house to take a milk even. Uh, so it is so troublesome. So in my situation, what law says, what society says, what doctor says, because I want to understand, because we are not a individualistic society. Although we have patriarchy, because my colleague sister is having bipolar. She got 2-time divorce, but because I am social worker, earlier I used to work, and now because I know, because the person is also is excluded from society, so I should be with him. But
Yeah,
but
so Madam Rajeshri,
it is
can
so
you be,
troublesome for me. What should I do? Because RML doctor told me if he doesn't quit drinking, smoking, his problem will be bipolar 2, schizophrenia, or memory loss. Still, I am witness that so many things. I text him, okay, Ranjan, ये चीज करो, अच्छा ये लाना था, okay, you have to do this every time.
Rajeshri,
So I am afraid.
Ms.
What should I
Rajeshri,
do?
Chairman is
Like a
speaking to you.
person.
Hello,
Our chair is speaking to you. Please
can you
listen.
hear? Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Now, can you ask your question very simply, because
No,
we may
no,
not be able to answer.
I think I've understood the issue.
Okay.
So, Mr. Rashri, the issue is that, that part may have been a bit technical, but many issues like dyscalculia or learning deficits, which basically signify a kind of developmental problem as a person who's growing up, it can be quite mild. When they go on to develop mental illness, it often is more difficult to treat or slightly different. So it's very difficult for us to answer the individual person issue right now, till we do more research, till we collect more data. But this is exactly the scenario that that in psychiatry, the overlap between how the brain has developed, the stresses it is faced, and what will happen if drugs like nicotine and alcohol further damage the brain to the mental illness. We need to understand that. We need to understand that much better, so that the problems that you're facing can be reduced at every level. Because unless we really study this across in many, many different ways, we will not be able to give you the right answers.
Because now he started taking only one-time medicine, morning, because evening.
That you can discuss with your psychiatrist,
Yeah.
but to what medicine to take and how to make sure that it doesn't worsen unnecessarily is something that we can guide you by our cumulative experience and knowledge, but we need to create more knowledge. And that's all, that's the kind of research that we want to take ahead, so that we can face these problems in a more informed way.
Ms. Rajshri, I've sent a personal message to you because, important as it is, it does not pertain to our experts' topic
Right.
for today. It's very important, but it's an individual case, and we can't have individual consultations or righting any wrongs over here. Matthew, may I ask?
Any other questions? Yeah.
Sanjeev, in the older textbooks you find, especially in the 90s, the relative risk of genetic factors and environmental factors were weighed. For instance, with anxiety, it would be minimal. With schizophrenia, it would be maximal genetic factors. Environmental factors were maximum for so-called minor disorders like anxiety, and worse for... Does that kind of factorization still exist?
See, the issue, those kinds of studies were done at a particular time, and the research was clinic-oriented, and these are clinical samples. Most of the data that is coming up now are from population samples. And very often we do not have the clinical details about those available for the families and their social strata, because privacy rules do not allow you to collect family information beyond a particular point. So it's very, very difficult to
Segregate.
to segregate in the way that was done in the 50s and 60s, the current group of data. So long-term studies or long-term cohorts, both in the community and in the clinic, therefore become the only answer. So that if you follow up, let's say, just a random group of 10,000 children starting at age 10, like what Vivek and all have been doing, and see them for the next 15 years, what happens? Did anxiety convert into psychosis, or was it only transient and went off once the stresses of school and growing up were gone? So it's only those kinds of studies which will allow us to tell that. Obviously, there's a whole range of environmental issues that comes up with so-called common disorders, anxiety, panic, depressions, so to speak.
No. I had the clinical situation of a young lady deciding whether or not to conceive because her husband and she both suffer from fairly severe panic disorders, both high achievers otherwise.
Right.
And they want to know what is the risk for the child.
Impossible. Like I said, the genetic, even the largest GWAS studies for anxiety disorders pick up less than 0.8% of risk. And that is really not worrying about at all, both in the real and the metaphorical sense. For anxiety, for a person who has panic, to be worrying is a very difficult thing to control, but it would really be inconsequential.
One final question: is there any genetic evidence to support the genetic basis of resilience?
Well, that's a very important question, and that is being looked at because the biggest problem is, of course, linguistic. How do you define resilience? One in the family, the rock bottom of that is people in a multiple affected family who have not become ill. That's one definition of resilience, which is hard-nosed clinical psychiatry based. So if you have a family with 3 people with schizophrenia and 1 person without it, what is different in that 1 person? Or in monozygotic twins? But those families are very difficult to get. So discordant monozygotic twins have been very poorly studied. I think there are less than 40 or 50 twin pairs in the world in which one twin has schizophrenia, the other twin has done well. So those at the rock bottom end, at the baseline end, there are those. But then there are other studies from the GWAS end, which correlate with creativity, high stress tolerance, ability to keep to deadlines. But these are all data coming in from the very, how should I say, UK biobank kind of stuff, where they keep assessing people and nobody's very sure as to how they've been assessed. So depending on how you define resilience is going to be a different issue. One is also concerned that one should not pick up genetics of wellness in the urge, like happened 100 years ago, to create a Superman of uniquely resilient people. Perhaps a little bit of susceptibility is good for human beings. Perhaps being resilient is not such a good thing. And so that's a slightly off. Perhaps human frailty is a much more valuable thing than resilience. The long and short of it.
So basic answers, Ajit, is get married, have children, go forth and enjoy yourself.
Well, that's true for the whole world, so why not for those with psychiatric issues?
Dr. Matthew, I had a question, sir.
Go ahead.
Sanjeev said 2 questions, actually. One of it was connected to what you just answered here. This is about a case of a twin sister, very young, 12th grader, fraternal twins, and she's just been diagnosed with schizophrenia. The other sister seems to be, in terms of personality, this is someone I have known from the time she's been coming since she was 10. And the first time she came to me was with extreme night terrors. So I remember reading studies about the association between children having night terrors leading to early onset of schizophrenia. And for the first time, I'm seeing it. And I can't not connect the 2 things. But my question also was to know that what is the risk for the other twin, because the parents are concerned about it.
See, all these are mathematical risks. So the risk to the sibling would be below 5%.
Okay.
As per established studies, which is reasonably low, but is also 20 times higher than the general population.
Mm.
So that risk will be there. But I mean, one could order a whole range of tests, because they're not identical twins.
Yeah.
One could look for specific, what we call de novo variants, but there won't be any actionable output out of all that.
There's nothing can be done about even if
Nothing would be done about it, and you would not really, it would be prone to a lot of misinterpretation rather than actual interpretation at this point in time. There are very exotic findings, for example, with autism or extreme young onset of schizophrenia, that sometimes, like it happens in biology, mutations have occurred for the first time. The de novo mutations, their DNA is actually different from that of their parents, because some slight changes have occurred. And that seems to increase risk of both autism and childhood onset schizophrenia. That seems to occur quite commonly in autism and childhood schizophrenia, I believe 5 to 10 times more than general population. But what will you do with it? Even if this one person has got a different mutation, there's nothing you can do about it.
And in case we do identify
There's
extreme
nothing you'll be able to
factors
do about it.
in children, is there something that can be done to probably prevent?
No, because the number of genes involved in the brain is simply too large and it's too networked for us to, even for known diseases like, myotonic dystrophies or macular degeneration in just the eye, genetic technologies to treat that at this point in time cost upwards of $1 million each session. It's ultimately a question of understanding it, democratizing the knowledge, reducing the asymmetry, and actually making it accessible. Gene-based therapies will be available in neurology and psychiatry, probably, reasonably speaking, about 2 generations from now. But that shouldn't stop us from thinking about it or worrying about it now. Because unless we do it here and now, we will not be able to contribute to that space. I mean, we are the world's largest country. Therefore, we have the world's largest number of mentally ill, if you are the world's largest country. And therefore, you have to do something about understanding these diseases on your own.
Thank you, Dr. Jain.
Simple answers, reassure them, and
yes, at the
get
moment,
on with life.
Yes.
Maybe support the one who's got the illness.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, any other questions? I can only see comments in chat saying that they enjoyed the presentation. And as
yeah, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sanjeev, this is Monica Ghosh here.
Hi. Yes.
So I just have a simple question. During the pandemic, the number of mental health issues increased, and I think it leaped. So my question was that and they may not have even had any kind of a genetic history. Do you think that kind of an impacted a whole generation after this? Because many of them have suffered very severely. So do you think it would have had a genetic impact?
Well, there are I'll give you 3 different factors about this. One is that after the 1919 flu epidemic, turns out that there's an increase in the diagnosis of schizophrenia of children who were in utero at that point of time. So the exposure during pregnancy to the virus bumped up the risk for schizophrenia in children who were born soon after. Also, soon after the pandemic, there was an epidemic of von economoencephalitis. Those of you who have seen the movie called Awakenings, that's the kind of Parkinsonism, psychosis that occurred as a direct result of that infection. We have not kept records of those kinds of serious neuropsychiatric complications in the country, and I'm sure there must be an index of women who conceived or who were pregnant, and they will be followed up by the ICMR. So we'll answer that question. But the third issue is about social isolation or the experience of the pandemic, either through grief or social isolation. And that goes back right to the beginning of, so the human brain is confined inside our heads and just 1.3 kilograms. But for its constant functioning, it needs what we call consciousness. Just like our lungs need air and our heart needs blood, our brain requires social stimulation. To the brain, the social stimulation is as essential as oxygen is to the lungs. So if you deprive a lung of oxygen for a long time, it's going to have consequences. And the same way, if you deprive your brain of social stimulation for a long time, it's going to have consequences. Because it is plastic, some people may recover better, some people may have long-term effects, but social isolation or social anomie is far more damaging to the brain than we realize. And that's because the brain, no matter, we should not think of the brain as a dichotomy between biology and psychology. Everything, it's interlinked because the brain is creating its psychology and it's interacting with other people's psychology. So it's a process. It's like breathing. So you don't bother about whether the oxygen you're breathing is being breathed by somebody else. It's a process which goes on. Same thing goes with thoughts, same thing goes with emotions, same thing goes with everything else. So social isolation and social disruptions actually cause persistent damage to the brain. How it's going to play out, I have no idea at the moment. Sorry.
Thank you. That was a very interesting talk. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
So it's gotten up to 5:36. So shall I close? I don't think there's any other questions. And I want to thank Sanjeev for a very interesting talk. As Sanjeev said, some of it might have been technical, but there are things that you can inquire about. And if somebody wants, they can probably get to Sanjeev or write to him. And this whole series of lectures every month is available on YouTube. So anybody can watch it anytime. If you can tell your friends and colleagues to watch all these 18 episodes that were there for the last 1.5 years. So thank you very much, everybody. And let's send you back. Oh, there's Marisa also saying, enjoyed your talk.
Oh.
Hi, Marisa. So send everybody back to, is it Rohini who's going to wind up?
So yes, I'm just giving the vote of thanks. Devika will wind up. Thank you.
Back to Devika?
Devika, yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Sanjeev.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Sanjeev, for an intriguing lecture on genes and mental disorders and for sharing your expertise, insights, and experiences with us today. Your lecture has broadened our understanding, perspectives, and has left a mark on our collective consciousness. We are very grateful for your presence and your dedication, and also your unwavering commitment to improving the mental health and social well-being. At this time, I'd also like to thank Dr. Matthew Burgess for having chaired the session. Thank you, Doctor. At this time, I also request the audience to reach out to us on the email ID. If you have any further questions or comments, the email ID will be shared in the chat box. As we've reached the end of the session, I request Ms. Rohini Rajiv, who is the chairperson of the Academic Public Service and Publication Committee and also a member of the Managing Committee, to deliver the vote of thanks. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Devika. Thank you so much, Dr. Jain, for having accepted our invitation. Professor Emeritus from NIMHANS, someone who's been deeply involved in the life of our residents and all of us. We've been looking forward to your lecture for a long time now, sir. So we're really happy that it's come about today. It was very educative and excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Matthew, for agreeing to chair the session. And thank you, Dr. Ajit, for accepting the option of welcoming everybody and always being the nudge behind the scenes to get things going in the lecture series. I don't know what I'll do without you, sir. Thank you so much, all the participants, members, life members of the Medico Pastoral Association, the staff of MPA who are the work behind all our lecture series, Ashwin especially. Thank you so much for always supporting. My thanks to my fellow managing committee and working committee members. for their encouragement and kindness. If I don't thank Mr. Ganeshan, I would be failing in my duties. Microlabs has been our technology support partner. Thank you so much. And thank you for sparing your Saturday evening and being a part of the MPA lecture series month on month. We look forward to seeing all of you in August as well. Have a wonderful evening and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. Please visit and follow us on our YouTube page where the recording will soon be posted. Thank you once again.
Thank you,
Bye.
Devika.